Welcome to episode 46 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern. My name is Stanislav, a 3-3 elk here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, it's the 3-3 elk, Shane Beeps.
Stan, what's up from the remote regions of Idaho? I'm traveling for work again, so I got the mobile setup going.
There's probably really elk in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, aren't there?
There were definitely a lot of camouflage hats that I've seen so far.
Do the elk wear the camouflage hats?
Or are people trying to hide from the elk?
Yes.
I think maybe they got elked.
Also with us here in Chicago, the 3-3 elk himself, Dave Harburger.
That's me eating grass.
Is that an elk noise?
That's an elk noise. Yeah. What do you think the elk noise when you get turned into an elk is just like? Is that it?
Oh man,
you're an elk now.
Poof.
The 3-3 elk Zach Culhan is off this week. On today's show, we're diving into the newest bad boy on the block. It's Oko week, and no, we're not talking about the 6-mana trickster. We're going deep on the Thief of Crowns, why he's suddenly become so impactful across formats, some decks he's appearing in Modern, and how to deal with one when he's on the board.
So is there a way to deal with them on the board?
Later.
I don't know. I want to know now. I really want to know.
We call that a tease in the industry.
We kick off the show with a look at SCG Atlanta. Then we wind down with a check-in on our experiences with Magic's newest format and early Pioneer results. But first, some housekeeping. Shout out to our newest patrons this week, Jared K. and Andre G.
It was funny how Jared K actually joined during our recording last week, and we had to I was like, do we just shout out Jared K right now?
I think in the future, if you want to maybe get a breaking news alert forced on the dive down, you can try signing up for our Patreon around 8 p.m. Central Time on a Monday
that'd be
night.
Perfect.
Yeah, you might hack the show.
That's our call to action. All wannabe patrons join at 8 p.m. Central next Monday.
Yeah, if you'd like to support the show directly, you can sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown, where we have a variety of fun rewards for people at every tier, ranging from access to our private chat room, signed cards, custom tokens, and custom playmats. The show is always free to all of our listeners, including bonus episodes. But for those who want to throw a little extra money our way, we've got physical rewards we're always excited to share with you.
Another way you can support the Dive Down is through our friends at manatraders.com. So rent cards for MTGO or in paper with their digital subscription service. If you don't use Mana Traders, you can sign up with coupon code TheDiveDown, all one word, and get 10% off your first 3 months of service. Play more decks, new strategies, and get better at Magic with manatraders.com.
Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump over to Dave with this week's breakdown from sunny Hotlanta, Georgia.
I've never heard that before, Stan. It's like an original gag? I think it's because it's warm there, right?
That's right. That's from a song I wrote in the late 90s.
You have a Grammy. We don't talk about it very much.
It's one of my Grammys. I try to stay humble.
Oh, okay.
Stan's got the EGOT.
I mean, it sort of shows why Stan has time to do the podcast now. He's just getting those royalties from ASCAP or whatever.
You really don't have to keep a day job if you make a living off royalties.
Yeah, if you came up with the phrase Hotlanta, you don't need to keep a day job.
And you're on happy birthday, which is really weird to know.
This week, like Stan said, we're going to take a look at Star City Games Atlanta Open, which was the Modern format. Later on in the show, after we do our dive down, we're going to take a look at the first Pioneer Challenge on Moto, but for now, we're going to stick to Modern. So spoiler alert, Magic across all formats has gone Loco for Cocoa this weekend, or Cocoa for Cocoa Puffs, Oko Puffs. I don't know. What phrase do we want to...
I'm cuckoo for Oko Puffs?
Yeah, exactly.
Oko's no Joko.
Perfect.
Oko's kid tested, mother approved.
Oko's Broco. That's what people like to say too. So there's
nobody better lay a finger on my butter Oko.
Lego my Oko.
Let's run this into the ground.
Yes, perfect. So you probably, if you were on social media or Magic social media at all this weekend, you probably saw lots of stories as Oko had success literally across every format except for Pauper. And wouldn't be surprised to see him show up there.
I was just going to say, it's really only a matter of time before the Pauper community figures out how good he is.
Just color in that set symbol black. You're good to go.
So yeah, apparently Oko was in the finals of the Vintage Challenge winner and the Legacy Challenge winner, or at least in the top 8 of the Legacy Challenge on Moto. And also, in Standard, there was an online arena MCQ that was over 2 days, where I think the day 2 metagame was something like 60% Oko decks. All of these are non-footnoted, non-verifiable, because we don't deal with formats other than Modern and sometimes Pioneer. But anyway, so we're going to talk about how amazing Oko's showing was at SCG Atlanta. So I got to watch some coverage on day 1. Did you all get to see any matches?
I did.
Yeah, I had it on audio only mode while I like cleaned my gutters and such. It was truly an adult day.
Dude, that is what I do every time I mow the lawn. Is like it's just me and Cedric like out there, or whoever's on camera. It's a lot of Brian Gottlieb these days, but out there doing my yard work. Emma Handy. Yep, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I thought there were some really cool matches. It seemed like a pretty, immediately off the bat, I noticed something interesting, that after the diverse metagame of the regionals weekend, it looked like the meta had snapped back to something that was much more kind of competitive focused. At least it felt to me like a lot of the on-camera matches had one of a few different decks on it. And so we will kind of take you through the story of how that evolved, but get ready for a slightly narrow meta on this particular event. Seemed like Urza was everywhere, seemed like Titan was everywhere, seemed like Death Shadow was everywhere. And it kind of looked that way on Twitter too. So I did a little bit of poking around on the SCG ATL hashtag, and I saw 2 tweets that were pretty interesting. One was from Michael Kidd, at that Jund Kid, who said he went 6-2, should be locked for day 2 at SCG ATL with Jund. Played Urza 3 or 4 times. Burn, Titan Shift, and you are through the breach. So out of 8 rounds, this player played Urza 3 or 4 times, and another person named Destry Cravens. Well, I went 4-4-1, played against Whirza a total of 6 times. I won't read the rest of his tweet, but 6 times out of 9 rounds. Pretty wild. So I think that other than some of the spicy things that we got to see, like Crabvine and a couple other things like that, it mostly felt like I spent a lot of Saturday watching Urza. And in particular, there was one Urza deck that featured very, very heavily. And it was a surprising one. And that deck was this new Simic Urza build from Team Lotus Box, featuring well-known SCG grinders like Zan Syed, Abe Corrigan, Collins Mullen was on camera a lot, Edgar Malgahez was, as were a couple of other of the team members on Lotus Box. And so it looks like, once again, they managed to innovate on a deck that was already there and bring something really big and do really well with it. The talk of the weekend was Urza, but he had a new friend, and that was the shirtless wonder themselves, Oko.
Yeah, it's I know we're going to get into this deck detail a little bit more, but it's crazy to me how by streamlining the deck, it seems like they made it even better. And so I think that says something about deck construction sometimes.
Yeah, not only that, but the fact that Urza can be paired with just like such a long list of artifacts and, prison enabling cards, it feels like the possibilities are endless thanks to this one creature.
Yeah, and there really aren't any prison-y kind of elements to this deck in a lot of ways, right? Because what we're looking at here is really, so the deck that Team Lotus Box brought to this tournament was basically adding 4 Gilded Goose to help with early turn mana and also getting an early artifact out. It had 4 Emery, 4 Urza, and then also 4 Oko Thief of Crowns in the main deck. Additionally, the deck played Cryptic Command and Metallic Rebuke as kind of a piece of tech to be able to get out there for a cheap mana leak with all the artifacts. And the thing that it kind of cut back on in order to do that was infinite combos. So there's only 1 copy of Sword of the Meek, 1 copy of Thopter Foundry, and only 2 copies of War of Invention in the main deck.
Yeah, and Zan was saying that that's not even ubiquitous across all their lists. Like, I think he was saying that Edgar still doesn't think it's necessary to have the combo, but Zan kind of wanted the instant win button from time to time, so he's still running it. But it's wild that it's just a deck that's playing like counter spells and creatures that have tons of value attached to them or can find value in your graveyard like Emery. I think it's surprising to me that it took so long for these decks that were already running blue to start running Metallic Rebuke, because it seems like it makes so much sense.
Yeah, it does seem like it's just kind of free value, and I wonder if it was just sort of like a lep was made because people were playing the Mystic Dispute or Mystical Dispute, and so they realized that this one is just as easy to use and probably has broader application and costs only a single mana more often. The other thing that's really interesting about this deck is that it is running one of my favorite combos in Modern lately, which is Mystic Sanctuary along with the Cryptic Commands. Also one of Shane's favorite combos.
Oh yeah, I mean that is the killer app for Mystic Sanctuary. Like if you weren't able to loop your cryptics or even a single cryptic, like Zan and his deck tech mentioned, even if you just have a single cryptic, what you can do is you can then activate your Emery to get your
Mishra's Bauble.
Mishra's Bauble, yeah. And then you sack your Mishra's Bauble, draw it on the opponent's upkeep. You always have access to a cryptic command when you're doing that. So it doesn't even require like looping two of them, like I've seen in some mid-range based decks.
Yeah, I've done a good amount of this lately online for better or for worse, and managed to do things like lock people out of creature combat 5 or 6 turns in a row while I kill them with a flyer, or deck people by, not with this particular deck, but deck people by recasting Thought Scour several times to take them from 10 to 15 cards down to 0 while I cryptic commanded them and made them unable to do anything. Certainly eats up some clock on Magic Online, but in this deck, it definitely feels like it's part of the main plan is to loop these cryptic commands over and over again. Really powerful combination, especially, Zan mentioned as well on the deck tech. And by the way, there's a really good deck tech where Zan explains a lot about the deck on the Star City coverage page. So you should go watch that if you have a second. But he mentioned that, you can get to a point where you can play Urza and then have Cryptic Command up because of all the artifacts that you have in play. And that's a pretty good place to be.
So do you think this is ultimately a control deck that's using cards like Cryptic, obviously, but also Engineered Explosives and Oko, basically to just play a control game, and then if they have to sideboard into Damping Sphere or Ensnaring Bridge or Cage, that's when they start to play a more prison strategy?
My take on it is that I think that they're just trying to grind out value and kill you with either instant win button with the combo without, having to have that be drawn so much, or killing people with constructs, which is pretty interesting way to do it. Or Elks. Honestly, you get Oko out, you get some stuff going, and then you start turning your own artifacts into Elks. So I do think you get to play a little bit more of a mid-rangey game with it than combo, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if you have an Emery sticking on the board and you're getting back your cheap artifacts or even your non-cheap artifacts from the graveyard, you can then Oko them and turn them into Elks. You sort of have like this really good supply of free or cheap creatures coming out of your graveyard. It seems like a really crazy engine, and it's surprising to me that it took a little bit to get down to this where it's just like, hey, these cards have so much inherent value that we don't need to do a lot of finagling with them. We can just control the game and use the value inherent in them to just generate more value than our opponents over the course of 3 games.
So let's go on to day 2 really quick so we can see what effect this deck and the pervasiveness of it had on the day 2 meta. And 109 players made day 2 of the event, and we're going to break it down into tiers for people to see kind of like by percentage. So the top tier of day 2 decks were Simic Whirza and Amulet Titan. Simic Whirza had 10 pilots and Amulet Titan had 9, which is pretty amazing. So there were 9.17% of the day 2 meta was Simic Whirza, and then Amulet Titan was 8.2%. So clearly Amulet is looking strong after its really good regionals performance, where it was really a standout as far as top 8s went. I think that's continuing here, and it still is like a very good deck to be packing right now if you have it in this world where you're mostly going to be fighting. You're going to be fighting against Urza quite often.
So, Dave, you're calling the Simic deck a Whirza deck. Did that always feature War of Invention? I wasn't certain.
All of them were really close to the same deck from what I could tell.
Okay.
And the name list online is Simic Whirza.
Got it.
The second tier, there were I would say there's 4 decks in the second tier. 7 pilots were on 4-color Whirza. So let that sink in for a second. There were 10 pilots on Simic Urza and also 7 pilots on 4-color Urza. Then there was 7 pilots on Green Tron, 7 pilots on Burn, and 6 pilots on Crabvine for between 5.5 and 6.4% of the meta between all in each one of these kind of deck categories. So more Urza, big mana, big burn, and the latest dredge variant that people are enjoying these days.
Yeah, this deck just shot up to a surprising popularity.
Crabvine, you mean by this deck, right?
Yes, Crabvine.
I mean, it's just got to be the fact that no one is packing Graveyard Hate anymore. And I don't think there's a lot of spots for Graveyard Hate when you have to worry about these super powerful artifact strategies.
But don't those artifact strategies still rely on the graveyard? I'm surprised if people are really still skimping out on it.
Well, I think that's a big difference. I don't think that the Simic deck really relies on the graveyard at all. It's just it's just decent against it, but they still have other game plans that they can do. The Jeskai Ascendancy one does rely on the graveyard, although that deck's falling out of fashion, and also there are ways to win without Graveyard Hate against that deck.
And it wasn't even listed in the day 2 metagame.
Yes, it was. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So Crabvine also had a nice deck tech from Oliver Tomiko, which I think is worth watching. I think the deck is actually good, and if you liked playing Hogak or Dredge and you held on to your Vengevines, I think this is a good deck to try out. It's not a super expensive deck if you have the mana already, so I think it's a good way to evolve if you love these graveyard aggro strategies. One thing that's really cool is that this deck runs, not only does this deck run Crab, Hedron Crab, to be able to have a reliable source of self-mill, it also runs the new Merfolk Safekeeper from
Secret Keeper.
Eldraine. Secret Keeper, yeah. And then also runs Glimpse the Unthinkable, which is sort of interesting given that a bunch of decks were trying out Tome Scour in the Faithless Looting slot, and I think they were all just finding like, forget it, we'll just use double Tome Scour. So now that we've looked at the top tier and the second tier, I just would like to point out that we have gone through decks that comprise 42% of the day 2 meta between these 7 decks, six archetypes actually. I don't think we've seen a deck that I would consider particularly interactive. I guess the Simic Whirza deck is kind of interactive since it's sort of mid-rangey and has counter spells and has some kind of counterplay. But it's interesting that these 6 decks essentially make up the about half of the metagame from the weekend.
Don't forget that Burn interacts with your opponent's face.
Yeah, is it? Do you consider it to be that way?
I mean, I think this argument is just something to, for people to sort of dither about, and it's not really super meaningful.
Whether a deck is interactive or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think it doesn't interact in the typical fashion. Like, it interacts with opposing creatures to get damage through, and that's really about it.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's not even a great way to think about the health of a meta when people start talking about interactive versus non-interactive decks? You're like, I'd rather talk about something else in that discussion.
Yeah, we kind of had a discussion today, at least Stan and I had a really short discussion about sort of, the B word, and we kind of got to my thinking about like sort of what makes me concerned about a deck, and it's not whether or not it's interactive. It's kind of about, aspects we've talked about in the pod before, like what does hate look like? What does, what are you able to successfully interact with it yourself? Like if they're a linear combo, like how successful can your interactivity be? Things like that. So yeah, I think some people like that. I think it's kind of a vestige of a lot of people who play formats like Legacy, or they may be coming from Standard, where the interactivity is typically higher in both those formats in a lot of ways. Yeah, I mean, long story short, long answer short. I don't have a great answer for you, Dave.
I mean, we do start to encounter interactive decks as we start to go down the list and even look at the winner of the tournament.
Correct. And that's the thing that's super interesting, is that the last tier of decks that we'll be talking about right now as a grouping of the major metagame is the decks that registered 5 pilots and 4 pilots on day 2. And those decks were Titan Shift had 5 pilots, Grixis Death Shadow had 5 pilots, Eldrazi Tron had 5 pilots, Jund Shadow had 4 pilots, and Original Jund, the Shadowless Jund, as I like to call it now, also had 4 pilots.
Bloodbraid Jund.
Yeah, and each of those comprised about 4.5 and 3.6% of the metagame. So together, these decks were right around 25-ish% of the metagame themselves.
So when we talk about the way they're interacting, so the first step is going to be Thoughtseize Inquisition, right? They're just sort of interacting with their opponent's hand. They're trying to disrupt these more linear game plans. So, they're trying to remove the Urzas, they're trying to remove the Emrys, and sort of shut down their engine pieces, right? And then after that, they have the pieces of removal along with their clock, with things like a big Tarmogoyf or a large Death Shadow, and getting that damage across before the engine can be put online. The typical mid-range strategies, right?
Basically.
Yeah.
A tale as old as time.
It's funny that's the counterplay, right? So we have like the popular decks are engine combo-y, huge value in things like the Simic Whirza. We have some combo-y Whirza and like the 4-color, Titan Shift, Mono Green Tron. And they're trying to just enact either a big mana plan or an artifact combo plan. And then the other side of the coin right now just is like maybe my hand interaction and my board interaction as such will get the job done after the fact.
So what you said, I think, is a great segue, Shane, because I went back and I looked at some of the larger kind of metagame chunks by kind of glomming together some of the decks. So if you look at the day 2 meta overall, there were 22 Urza decks out of the 109 decks that made day 2, which accounts for 20.1% of the metagame. So 20% of the day 2 metagame was Urza of some fashion. Now that included all kinds of varieties, whether it was Simic, whether it was 4-color War, whether it was Ascendancy, whether it was Outcome. Obviously, Ascendancy and Outcome didn't even register on our kind of tier list for this week, so they were less than 4 copies apiece. But altogether, 20% Urza. The next block down that I kind of saw when I was looking at this list was that there were 14 Titan decks out of 109 decks on day 2 for 12.8% of the meta. So between Amulet Titan and Titan Shift, there were 14 of those, which is also still a really significant part of the metagame. After that was Death Shadow decks. There were 12 Death Shadow decks for 11% of the meta, which includes things like Grixis Death Shadow, Jund Death Shadow. There was also a couple of 4-color Death Shadow decks and 1 Sultai Death Shadow deck all in there. Guess what the Sultai and 4-color Death Shadow decks were running?
Oko.
Yeah, it's Oko. That's why they got in there. None of those decks placed as high as the Grixis Death Shadow or Jund, as it turned out. The another bucket there is Tron decks. Now, we always have a little bit of kind of concern about grouping Eldrazi Tron and Mono Green Tron together in the same bucket, but there were 12 decks, also 11% of the meta running play sets of Tower, Mine, and Power Plants. And then finally, the last major group that I saw kind of looking at it was Burn-esque decks, which was at 9%. So 8% or 9 decks or 8% of the meta, basically.
So what this is like 65% combined for these 5 groups?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good portion. I actually would have guessed higher on the Urza decks, to be honest with you.
You would have guessed higher than 20%?
Yeah, I would have guessed higher based on how it felt.
Yeah.
What really stands out to me from this list is that the first 3 decks you mentioned are really defined by the creatures within them. Whether it's Urza, whether it's Primeval Titan, whether it's Death Shadow, it seems like these are almost the impactful build-around cards that certain strategies are coalescing around in terms of their impact on the format.
I mean, what's really interesting is what's missing from this list in some ways too, which is former or recent pillars of the format, which are Stoneforge Mystic and Noble Hierarch / Aether Vial would be the ones that I would say are kind of missing from this list right now. Probably some others to consider, but those are the ones that come to mind immediately as being kind of absent.
There's no path in any of these 5 chunks. Like our color, our single color, single mana spells that formerly seem like they've defined the format aren't quite as valuable right now, it seems, or they're not quite as format pillars. We have different pillars now and they just cost more mana, but because there's so much acceleration, especially with the artifact acceleration, that it seems like it doesn't even matter.
I wonder if one of the takeaways here is that mid-range is just in a better position right now than control.
I think it's that hand disruption is in a better position than sweepers is kind of what it is. And so that's what control generally gets to bring to the table and what mid-range gets to bring to the table, at least traditionally as the decks are built in Modern. And I think one of the big indicators of that being the paradigm instead is that so Stoneforge is still generally a mid-rangey kind of plan, right? And there's almost none of those decks in the day 2 meta, but there's a lot of Thoughtseize decks in the day 2 meta, so.
And later, I think we can talk about too, Stan, with the impact of Oko in these decks that can run him. It kind of invalidates a lot of the former competitive strategies that would be able to work against it.
All right, so let's talk about what happened in the top 8. So it turns out that Team Lotus Box put 4 team members into the top 8. Edgar Magalhaes, Collins Mullen, Jeremy Bartaroni, and Zan Syed all made the top 8, all on Simic Urza. There was also a 5th player on Simic Urza, Eli Cassis. Eli was on a pretty different build without Emery or Gilded Goose, so it's hard to say it's the exact same deck as the Lotus Box one, but it was definitely built up around having Oko as one of your main things. But here's the big twist, is that Urza didn't win the tournament. So here's the top 8 from first place to 8th place. So in first place was John Holland on Grixis Death's Shadow, who managed to get through all of these matchups, playing Urza a whole bunch during the weekend and won the tournament.
I think he had home court advantage. I learned in the interview that he's from Atlanta.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so the judges were probably helping him subtly.
He got to sleep in his own bed on Saturday night. That is a good advantage.
He didn't have any time zone weirdness, all that stuff that they talk about in football matchups.
Yeah, he was a West Coast Grixis Death Shadow pilot traveling east for the game. That's always
it's just brutal. Yeah, and the altitude there.
Do you think that John Holland is better Grixis Death Shadow pilot in a dome, or is he good in the open air?
Well, when you have your wind at the back, the wind at your back, you can do the 65-yarder, but in the dome, there's no wind at all, so it's just really still. Yeah. John Holland could probably kick a 72-yarder.
Yeah, I think so too. In second place was Collins Mullen with Simic Whirza. In third place was Jeremy Bertaroni with Simic Urza. In fourth place was Zan Syed with Simic Urza. In fifth place was Austin Collins with the Amulet Titan. Sixth place, Eli Cassis, Simic Urza. Seventh place, Edgar Magalhaes, Simic Urza. And finally, Matt Clutter with Devoted Devastation. Eighth place.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt. We're here for you.
Keeping the dream alive.
Real quick, nothing too interesting about the Grixis Death Shadow deck, but way to pull it down in a field full of Urza. The main thing I thought was interesting was that John Holland had 1 Royal Scions in main and 1 in the side. It feels like that's starting to be a little more acceptable in the Grixis Death Shadow decks as sort of a redundant kind of card filtering engine, and also a way to, an alternate way to team or battle rage your Death Shadow occasionally in a pinch, and also a win con of its own if you manage to hold the board long enough.
Yeah, I've been hearing some rumblings, specifically on the Midweek Modern podcast, which is kind of a reconfigured version of the Birthing podcast. And one of the co-hosts there was saying that, the power of Royal Scions seems quite real in Grixis Death Shadow, and that there's been some other rumblings about, I think Edgar himself was saying something like Team or Battle Rage is kind of a sacred cow, and that Royal Scions might be a legit replacement for it once people realize it.
Yeah, it's almost like you listened to our own podcast on the spoiler episode where one of your co-hosts said that that might be a possible use for the Royal Scions. I'm not going to say which co-host.
It was Emma.
Yeah, it was.
It was I guess it was your click to pick, wasn't it, Dave?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, Dave talked for 12 minutes about it. It was great.
It was maybe it was our click to pick, David.
And someone said, what does it replace? And I said, maybe Team or Battle Rage? It turns out that in John Holland's build, it's more likely that Royal Scions is replacing Lightning Bolt. There's no Lightning Bolts in his build, and there was also only a 1x of Serum Vision, so I think that's some of the slots that Royal Scions is getting, is replacing in his build.
If you look at this top 8 and day 2 meta, Lightning Bolt is not good enough.
Not good enough.
All it kills is Emery.
Yeah, it's not good enough if you're not going face, right?
Yeah.
Also, nothing too surprising in the Amulet Titan or Druid combo deck lists, other than the fact that it looks like Druid combo is now running now running some quantity of Oko as well.
Yes. Here's a little tease. I'll talk about that in the dive down.
So there's your top 8. I think we should talk about Urza in general in the metagame really quickly right now, just to give a sense of kind of how things broke down. So we already talked about the fact that the day 2 meta was 20% Urza decks. But why don't we go from the top down? So as we said, there were 5 Urza decks in the top 8. That is 62.5% of the top 8. Further down, there were 9 Urza decks total in the top 16 for 56.25% of the top 16. So over half of the top 16 was Urza decks. There were 16 Urza decks in the top 32 decks of Atlanta for 50% of the metagame of the top 32. And finally, there were 21 Urza decks in the top 50 of Atlanta for 42%. So here's the deal. As the competition got higher, the percentage metagame of Urza also got higher. So it's hard to look at it any other way than to see that Urza had an incredible weekend, and it shows in the success rate and the win rates and all that stuff. I would like to say one thing, which is that, do you remember how we said that there were 22 Urza decks in day 2?
Oh, I do remember that.
Yeah, there were 21 Urza decks in the top 50, which means that out of 109 decks with 22 pilots on Urza, only one pilot of Urza did not top 50 with the deck. And that is the only player who made day 2 on Urza Ascendancy.
Uh-oh.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, right? And I feel like this is sort of, there might be some kind of, I'm not the logical fallacy guy. I'm not here to be internet logical fallacy guy and say that this is selection bias or something like that. There were a lot of excellent players on this Simic Urza deck. And so it's hard to know exactly how much of that is thanks to just how good these players are versus their deck selection. But, you got to think that the best players are going to try to pick the best decks as well.
I just want to think about, what if 42% of the top 50 decks had the word Death Shadow?
Yeah.
After them.
Right.
No one would be happy about that. Not a chance.
I mean, if it was any of them, if they all said burn, no one would be that happy about that either, I don't think, right?
Yeah. But it's just, I think right now it's almost the fact that it's like mildly obfuscated behind like these different deck names. But Urza is the core of all of them.
Yeah. And they're combo decks, mid-range decks, control decks. It's all over the map as far as what they're doing, but they are all trying to Mox Opal you to death. Let's be honest.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I've been thinking about, right? Like when you talk about stats like these, it's easy to think about the B word, but it's like, is Urza the problem? Is Mox Opal the problem? Is it a problem at all? Like I'm kind of assuming the answer that everyone's agreeing with, something like that. But I mean, I don't know.
So that's kind of like Urza in a nutshell for this tournament. We talked about that deck a couple of weeks ago, so we don't have to dwell on it too much more. But let's talk about Oko now as a little bit of a preview for our dive down topic. And I want all the listeners to know that this means I really care about you, because I went through every deck list in the top 32 and manually did a count of how many Okos were in everybody's 75s. So,
you did Control F and you know it.
I had to go through individual pages though to do that, because it's not on. It wasn't on Goldfish yet when I did this.
Oh no, you couldn't expand all?
No, because I was going through Star City's pages. Anyway, the top 8 featured 22 Okos in 6 decks. The only decks that didn't have Okos in the top 8 were Amulet Titan and Grixis Death Shadow. The top 16 had 12 more Okos. There's a little bit of an Oko trough in the top 16. It's a little bit less there's only 12 more.
The uncanny Oko Valley.
Yeah, there were 4 Urza decks in the top 8 that had, there were 4 Urza decks in the rest of the top 16 that had a full play set that had 3 Okos apiece, basically. The top 32 had 32 more Okos across 10 different decks in 17th through 32nd place, including an Infect, Amulet, and a single 4-color Death Shadow pilot. So for Oko Watch 2019, like the beginning data point, the grand total is that across the top 32, there were 66 Okos and 75 across 20 decks out of the top 32. So that means 2/3 of the top 32 had an average of 3 Okos in their 75.
So Do you think we should talk about this card soon?
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about it in about 3 minutes.
Hold on, what? This wasn't Spirits Week?
This is not Spirits Week.
Oh, no.
I want to apologize to everybody who thought we would be on theme and do spirits for Halloween. We just had to talk about the ghost that is truly haunting the format, which is Oko.
And his abs.
So, quick takeaways from the tournament and things that I think we learned by looking at this metagame. If you like Urza, there's just about every flavor ready for you. Control, combo, mid-range, interactive. Enjoy it now because...
Who knows?
Anyway, the meta overall is mostly unchanged from regionals with a number of decks, but there are lots of... The kind of distribution has changed a lot with Urza being at the top. So just remember that what you might have seen at regionals, if you go to an open, it's probably going to be a lot more spiky and a lot more kind of top heavy with Amulet Titan and Urza. I think this is a great time to play Death Shadow, regardless of if you prefer Stubborn Denial or Tarmogoyf. They both seem to be showing up even with a meta that has a lot of main deck engineered explosives. I think you just have to be mindful of that when you're playing Death Shadow in particular. I think that if we're going to talk about bannings, we might need to talk about banning Team Lotus Box.
Right?
Are they the best team we've ever seen on Star City games?
I mean, they just have the skill, they have the preparation, they attend reliably, they bring typically mostly unified decks. So it feels to me they're like truly skewing things at this point on the SCG circuit, like for better or for worse, but they're like the data looks skewed because of our perceptions. And we see, in the top 4 of the top 8, that's the actual results of the tournaments, right?
I think if any of our listeners have ambitions of trying to go pro or maybe get really impressive results in competitive Magic, Team Lotus Box creates a really interesting model for how a team structure could work, where my understanding is like a lot of these players live in the same house and basically treat Magic as their full-time job, and they live and breathe decks, cards, and testing. And I think when you put that much work toward anything, over time, you start to see results.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting too is, speaking of Team Lotus Box, right, and their impact is, Syed, he had a very similar deck, and a few of them I think were running kind of this at regionals, right? And so people got kind of a sneak preview of it. I think that they talk about it on their Patreon,
Yes,
and probably stream it a little bit too. And so it was brought by more players than just them. So if someone wants to get a little bit of an edge, they can see, I think, what Lotus Box is playing or has recently been playing, and then bring it themselves, which additionally kind of puts a spin on the meta that you might see at an SCG.
Yeah, I think there's two things that are interesting here is that, clearly there have been some teams that have been as dominant on the Pro Tour and things like that, or testing teams and things like that. I just think that this is the first time there's been such a concerted effort put into Star City Opens. And there's good reason because, there's been a lot of talk about how GPs aren't as well supported for competitive players anymore. And so a lot of these players who are out there on the East Coast, who are part of the Star City circuit, don't really have a lot of motivation to get involved in kind of the Magic Fest circuit. And that's unfortunate. And maybe this is instructive to, Channel Fireball and the people and Wizards and everybody who's behind the Grand Prix circuit to see maybe it's worthwhile getting some of these players to come back. The other thing I would say is that if you want to help support Team Lotus Box, you can go to their Patreon and just kind of pay them, become a patron to see sneak peeks of their deck list and things like that. I mean, it's an interesting way for a group of players who are committed and at a time of their life where they can devote this to maybe help subsidize their rent. And so why not? I don't go to tournaments all that much, but I think I'm probably going to give them a follow on Patreon just to kind of help out and see how far they can take this.
Yeah, good call.
But they still need to be banned.
All right, we're going to write a quick open letter to the ban committee over at Wizards of the Coast, try to get Zan Syed and his team of hooligans out of here. But when we return, we're going to talk about Oko, Thief of Crowns. Heard of him? You will. Stay with us. There's a new walker in town. Oko, Thief of Crowns. If you haven't met him, allow me to introduce you. 1 blue-green for a 4 loyalty planeswalker at Mythic Rare. +2 make a food. +1, target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk creature token with base stats 3/3. And -5, exchange control of target artifact or creature you control and target creature an opponent controls with power 3 or less.
Oh, there's a minus on this card?
Yeah, it's basically fine print at the bottom of a contract.
Is that how you guys felt about that too? I'll be curious to see, because that's kind of how I felt about it. I still cannot abide that what is in the conversation is the best planeswalker ever has a line of type on it that says "make a food." Make a food.
You know,
that's not even a sentence. It's not make some food. Make food.
Make a food token.
Food.
You know what's great too is then when you then turn your food into an elk, it says "food is green."
Perfect.
That's my favorite part. Food is green.
Oh gosh. Okay.
So maybe it's obvious why we're talking about Oko this week, but if it's not, as we alluded to in the breakdown, Oko is everywhere these days.
That's right. Just a reminder that at SCG Atlanta, across the top 32, there were 66 Okos in 20 decks across people's 75s. And the average is that in 2/3 of the top 32, there were 3 Okos in their decks.
That's complicated math, Dave.
You know, think of it this way. 2/3 of the players are running Oko.
That's easy.
Close to a playset.
And so also, we see Oko being featured in decks that previously didn't have any planeswalkers at all, just as kind of a value-y card or a tech card or a creature generating card. Some people, like we've seen Sam Black, a very high skilled, experienced player, calling Oko the best planeswalker ever printed. Maybe even members of this podcast have called him that. And let's be honest, he's really handsome. He's a fine man. I'm confident to say that.
We don't usually talk about standard, but just a few weeks ago at Mythic Championship 5, I want to say it was 5. I can't keep track of Roman numerals. He was the most played walker, pushing out both Teferi Time Raveler and Nissa Who Shakes the World.
I think it like shakes worlds.
That card is super powerful. It's just not modern level powerful. I know you're kidding around a little bit, but there's some people talking about banning Nissa Who Shakes the World in standard instead of Oko. So different discussion for different podcasts. But
well, in this contemporary America, banning cards has been normalized, Dave.
Right, and in Modern, which is the focus of this dive, Oko's appearing in decks such as Amulet Titan, practically every Urza deck these days. Infect, 5-color Niv Mizzet, Devoted Druid combo, some Stoneblade decks, and the list goes on.
Sultai Control, Sultai Shadow, Sultai anything.
It's a long list.
Yeah, what's I'm just thinking, like, we've never really had a blue-green walker even remotely close to this power level, right?
I mean, I think there's basically only Kiora she's a blue-green walker, and then also Nissa from Amonkhet, right?
And there's the Tamio, the new Tamio.
Yeah, Tamio too.
So why is Oko suddenly so ubiquitous? I want to start perhaps by considering Oko's power level based on our typical criteria for planeswalkers, right? Just to start, he costs 3 mana.
It's a good start.
And since he's green, that enables him to be in a number of decks that have ways to cheat him out as early as turn 2.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much the 3 barrier in the last year essentially has been pushed, right? I mean, War of the Spark did it, and then we've gotten a whole bunch of other options. And this set, there's 2 3-mana walkers that are playable. It's amazing to see that kind of evolve.
I think it's also very hard to talk about Oko without acknowledging the fact that he is very hard to kill at 5 to 6 loyalty the turn he comes down.
That is honestly the deal breaker with Oko fundamentally. Just think about that. It's just truly insane.
What that means basically is that if you're on a burn style deck, it's going to cost you like 2 or 3 cards to kill Oko. If you are on a burn style deck that's trying to race it and not kill Oko, he can make food to give your opponent a chance to recover life, which we'll talk about, I guess, in a moment. If you're trying to kill Oko with creatures, it's generally going to take 2 creatures to get through in a lot of cases. And sometimes you might not even have a threat that's big enough to kind of keep up. So that loyalty is a big deal.
Yeah, and I think really what you're alluding to there is some of the ways he begins to actually generate card advantage over the course of a game, whether he's nullifying opponents' permanents, creating your own threats. He can even draw out games by generating a bunch of life via the food tokens.
He also generates sort of false life gain because your opponents want to get it off the board so badly. Like we'll talk about later for sure.
Yeah, and seriously, in a format like Modern, where making greedy mana bases is very easy because fetch lands are still legal, decks really don't have to stretch too far in order to cast him, it seems. In fact, in testing Oko, all three of us were able to try him in 3 different strategies. I played Devoted Devastation.
I was playing Bant Snowblade.
And I played him in Sultai Control, and all of us missed the boat on playing him in Urza. So go back to listen to our other episode about Urza. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, honestly, though, in Urza, it's just kind of like a mid-range value play, right? And I think we're going to definitely hit on the points of what makes him playable in a mid-range deck, especially me, because my deck is very mid-rangey.
Yeah, in making this episode, the question actually came up, which is, what is there to actually say about Oko that we haven't already said? Because it kind of seems like he's just good. And shout out to Dave H. for that great nugget.
From our Patreon. The other thing I would say too is, this same kind of outlook on Oko is what led us on our spoiler episode to really not talk about him there either. I think that all of us on the cast took a look at that card and said, this is a cool card. It's good. I don't really want to talk about it on the spoiler app.
Yeah, I was really close. Like he was like my 3rd card, but it was just like, yeah, it's a great value card. It's probably going to do something, but I want to talk about this weird tech card instead with crazy metal art. But Oko is probably a better idea for us to chit chat about.
Yeah, I guess we all thought that Oko would do something, but what we didn't anticipate is that he can do anything.
Yeah.
So what we're doing on this week's dive is assessing how Oko actually impacted games in the various decks that we played. We'll attempt to identify common play patterns that he leads to, explore how he's winning us games, consider some of the ways opponents were able to answer Oko, and wrap up a bit about our thoughts on the future role of this planeswalker if he stays in the format. So let's start with how we felt playing Oko and how he actually impacted our games. And I want to think that I kind of picked a curveball deck with Devoted Devastation, since that's really a combo strategy, and Oko doesn't actually support the combo, really just provides longevity, optionality, and value.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised that he's being played in a strategy like this, but then you look at all of the decks that's playing Oko, and it's hard to be surprised any longer, right? It's just kind of like a good secondary plan of attack.
Or just a way to keep you alive a little longer.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah, for the sake of science, I added several Okos to the main deck, and I never sided him out, basically to increase the number of times I drew him and really to analyze him across a variety of game states. And in the course of about 10 matches, I got to cast him 5 times and found he was actually bad to useless in only 1 instance. In every game I cast him, my opponent simply could not remove it, flat out. Unless he was outright countered, he is incredibly sticky. And once he was on the board, it was basically up to me to determine how to use him such that I can keep the game going long enough that I eventually execute my combo finish.
I think that's a super good point, Stan, right? Is that it's not the easiest card in the universe to know what to do with every turn. So, you can think about what is going to generate the value I need. Like, do I need more turns? Do I need to remove the text box on an opposing creature or artifact? Do I need to gain life? Am I adding power and toughness to my side of the board? Am I generating raw life gain through the food tokens? There's just so many. There's, like you said, the optionality is surprisingly outrageous with just, effectively 2 modes on the card. There's a 3rd somewhere if you want to use it now and then.
Yeah, and just to illustrate really quick, the one game I mentioned where he didn't matter was because I was straight up dead on board against Jund Death Shadow. My opponent had 2 7/7 shadows out, and if but one of them connected with me, I was dead. So in that situation, whether I turned one of them into a 3/3, whether I tried to gain life, which I didn't even have the mana to do, there was no way of really getting out of that situation because I was already so far behind. So maybe we can identify like some caveats where perhaps he doesn't fully stabilize you if you're going to lose on the crackback. But even so, I think in a stalemate, we're going to see that Oko is a great tool for just pulling ahead gradually at first and then taking over the game altogether.
Yeah, I mean, like most kind of powerful low mana plays, he's a lot better earlier in the game than later in the game quite often, right? Because sometimes, I mean, if you're behind on board, he doesn't necessarily catch you up immediately. He can do a lot, but if you get him down early, though, you can really establish control of a game and just kind of make the game go as long as you want to.
In most games, I'd either elk a big creature to slow down an opponent's clock. Against burn, I could just make food for days, so they essentially could never actually kill me. Even against outcome, I was able to shut off both an Urza, an Emery, a Mox, and practically anything else they cast except Ascendancy.
Yeah, the artifact and creature capabilities makes Oko so silly. Like, if it was just creatures, it would still be a lot, right? It's like, the +1, adding loyalty to the planeswalker while also invalidating a text box of one of the primary ways of generating value and effects in the battlefield. But no, you have to add artifacts onto that as well. So you can shut down so many important pieces in Modern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we sort of have underplayed the fact that how outrageous the elk line is, that it's a plus. And we read it earlier, but we haven't had that moment of, why is it a plus? Maybe we're going to talk about that more later, but really, why is it a plus? That's so absurd. I mean, so what I did one game was, in the deck that I played, was I dropped it and turned off a chalice on one.
Why not?
That was holding down all my cantrips and all my thought scours and like all the stuff I wanted to do with my deck. I was like, well, I got an Oko. Oh, you went chalice on one? That's cute. Bye.
So I'm curious to hear if you guys had a similar experience with me, but I really did feel that in none of my games did he actually present a win condition. Rather, I felt like he was basically just keeping me from losing. And as we'll get to later, I think it's this function that people need to really think about when they're facing an Oko. How do you win despite an Oko around, since he's probably just going to stick around till the game is over?
I mean, we're probably jumping ahead, but it's fine to do it now, I think. I don't think 3-mana walkers should be able to win the game by themselves, right?
What?
But I think Oko...
Outrageous.
Oko effectively wins the game by himself. Although I say that, and I immediately think of Liliana the Last Hope.
Yeah. But she needs to ultimate to win, I think.
Well, I mean, that's a perfectly valid way to use her in the shell that she exists in, right? So, I mean, but I don't think... I mean, something like Oko is effectively winning the game by itself, because it's providing you with so many capabilities of shutting down your opponent's strategies that if you're doing anything on your side to advance your own strategy, that you're going to come out ahead.
Yeah, I guess like the one condition where Oko wins you outright is if your opponent does literally nothing and you just turn a food into a 3/3 and beat face with that. But is that really a game of Magic?
So I would like to say that in the deck that I played, that was a strategy, because the deck that I played was all control, and I didn't have that many ways to kill my opponent. And so definitely sometimes making a food and turning it into an elk was the thing to do when I was holding a grip full of abrupt decays and assassin trophies and cryptic commands. Instead, I just needed a way to end the game.
So yeah, I think it's probably a good time for me to jump in and talk about playing Oko in Bant Snowblade or Snoko Blade, which is just essentially a Stoneforge Mystic Bant shell where she's supported by things like Teferi 3, Oko, Spell Queller, Icefang, Coatl, so on. So it's a fundamental mid-range strategy, which is a place where I think Oko can and is shining right now. So ultimately, Oko just acts like a mega value engine in this deck. So he's turning text boxes blank on the other side of the battlefield. He's creating creatures for you to attack and block with or put swords on. He's gaining you life, all while, like Stan said, being really hard for your opponent to remove. And so there's all sorts of really interesting interactions with Oko that I got to experience in this deck. So it runs right now just 1 or 2 Gilded Goose, while a full playset of Noble Hierarch. I would not be surprised to see that number of Gilded Goose move up to sort of mimic some of the Simic strategies we saw in the Atlanta Modern Open. So it can turn the food from Gilded Goose into a hasty 3/3, essentially. So if you have a goose on, that you played earlier with the food sitting out, you drop Oko and you +1 it to turn your food artifact token into a 3/3 creature. It's swinging that turn, right? So that's something that your opponent has to keep in mind when they're facing down these tokens.
And it's something that you could do as sort of an aggro out in the Simic list on turn 2. By the way, if you wanted to, if you can drop enough artifacts to get a Mox online, drop a couple lands, Gilded Goose, turn your food into a 3/3, you can be swinging on turn 2 if you really wanted to. Now,
like the Mox Opal and such.
Yeah. So,
I mean, you can, also some of the things that was great in this deck was turning like an Astrolabe that had already cycled itself from the cast into a creature. You no longer need that mana fixing really. So your single mana cycler is now a 3/3 elk. Your Ice Fang Quaddle that also cycled itself is now a 3/3 elk if you don't need the flying evasion thing wearing a sword. So you have flexibility there. There's also elking your Spell Queller in a deck like this, which is really nice because it simply removes that spell for good. A little rules thing I wanted to mention is there's wording differences on like a card like Deputy of Detention and Spell Queller. So that doesn't work with Deputy of Detention, but it does work with Spell Queller. So those cards, you're going to see them often in blue, white, or Bant shells. So don't think that it's going to work the same way.
Yeah, the same is true of Kite Sail Freebooter as well. If you elk a Freebooter, but then remove the elk, you will get Freebooter's card back.
Weird. Magic is weird.
Magic is weird. That's why it's so good. So, I did mimic some of Stan's things he said earlier. I definitely experienced some of the same things he did. But in a few matches that I played, Oko just effectively read 3 mana, gain 15 life, and beast from within 3 opposing creatures. Do you know what I mean? Because the opponent is so focused and probably needs to be focused on removing the Oko from the board that they're swinging into him with this huge amount of loyalty. So it's turn after turn of 3 or 4 damage going into Oko, where you're able to then cast an Ice Fang Quaddle and start blocking with it while still generating value on the ground. At the same time, you're invalidating the opposing creatures so that they're now like ground attackers instead of flyers. Like this was like a game against spirits where I'm just shutting down their flyers, or they're not able to put enough clock on me in the air to actually shut down my Oko. So I'm just gaining tons of life while generating food tokens, and they're attacking him instead of me.
Yeah.
At the same token though, or on the same token, or looking at the same token from Aladdin's Castle, Oko is creating 3/3 elks on the other side of the board, right? And I think that gets to why is it a plus? And I think maybe on the card design end of things, they're like, well, you're still giving the opponent some value. Like maybe if you're turning their artifact into a creature, they're now able to attack into you. But that still doesn't really balance out because 3/3 is not huge. If your opponent has a Noble Hierarch on the other side of the battlefield, which I experienced while playing Stan, is that 3/3 becomes a 5/5, and that's not too shabby by any means, but that's only in a certain deck strategy for sure. So I think that, even the fact that it's creating 3/3 elks on the other side of the board, typically in a mid-range strategy, you're able to control that pretty well, or have already generated enough blocking ability on your side of the board, or you've gained enough life from the food tokens that it's not a huge liability.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look at the deck that I was playing, so like I said, I played a Sultai Control deck that was, very heavy on Cryptic Command, Into the Story, Thought Scour, Drown in the Lock, and had Oko just kind of in there as a value planeswalker as part of a, kind of just like a good card to have. Giving my opponent elks was actually a little bit more dangerous because I didn't have a lot of blockers, and I didn't have a lot of blockers that were going to live through the elks. So either I needed to be gaining more life with food, which, if they attacked their elk enemy, they were often attacking the Oko, so I didn't necessarily get to do it. So there is this kind of like weird tension in a deck like the one that I was playing, where you want to make sure that you deploy Oko at the right time and under the right conditions so that you can use it as a win con, basically. So it was sort of like this interesting dual card where if I needed to drop it to get rid of something that was holding me up at the beginning of the game, like a chalice on one, like I was talking about, I could do that, and that was kind of an escape hatch. Or I could hold it in my hand until late in the game when I've established control with a bunch of cryptic commands, or I've drawn a zillion more cards than my opponent, and so I know that I have assets to be able to protect it, and then I can sit down and play it.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads us into the next point, Dave, which is like, what are the play patterns we experience with Oko, right? And I think yours are novel in the control shell, right? Because in my deck, I was generating a lot of either smaller creatures that quickly became no longer necessary as the game went on. So my Mana Dorks or my Ice Fang Coatls or things like that already generated some kind of value by cycling themselves, for instance. Or, I had enough mana on the battlefield that a Noble Hierarch was no longer that valuable. So either I could elk it myself and then have a blocker to typically trade with the elks on their side, or I was just buying time by trading them or by chump blocking with them against the opposing elks and then suiting up a flyer with a sword or giving something protection from the colors on the other side of the battlefield and being able to get that damage through for the win. My play patterns seem kind of straightforward. Like if there's a text box you want to remove it. And if there's a creature on the other side of the board that can kill Oko, you remove it by elking it. Otherwise, you can turn something into an elk on your side of the board, like you need that 3/3, or you can start going ham on the loyalty with that +2. What did you think, Stan?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of thinking about it in terms of Dave's question, which I sort of used to frame this topic, which is, why talk about Oko? Isn't he just good? I felt like in most situations, if I could play Oko, there was practically zero downside to doing that. Unless I was concerned with like just executing my combo on the spot, or if I thought I was playing him into a counterspell. There was almost never a board state where he wouldn't impact it in some way, assuming I wasn't just dead on board outright. And something that Zach had pointed out to us, which I think is generally true, that his elking ability is almost understated in how powerful it is. And how impactful in Modern especially it is to just remove a text box from a creature, especially in a format with like the best creatures of the last 16 years. Unless it's an empty board state, there's almost no reason to make food.
Yeah, I think it was Ari Lax who said something like, your creature now, anything that costs like over 3 CMC now needs to read, have a really interesting text box on ETB. Otherwise, it's just going to read as a 3/3 elk.
That's maybe one of the problems we'll talk about in regards to Oko later on. But I do think it's interesting to point out that most of the situations that you guys are talking about are places where, again, to reiterate what I was talking about, where you have permanence in play that you can make a choice if you want to elk or your opponent wants to elk. And so it's interesting that, this does feel like it's just sort of a perfect D mid-range card, really a super powerful mid-range card. And if you start trying to like jam it into a control shell, I think it's a little bit less effective potentially, or just a little bit harder to play with in that space. One thing that was interesting, to go back to Zan Syed talking about the Simic deck from the Atlanta over the weekend, he said something on his deck tech that was basically like, well, this is the real Jund, which is like the most wild thing when you think about it.
Yeah, that was madness
when he said that. But then I was kind of like, okay, after, us talking about this and preparing for this episode, I can kind of see where he's coming from with that idea.
Stan, when you were playing with it, because we were playing more mid-rangey, creature-y type decks, did you make any kind of rules of thumb? Like when you were thinking about targeting something to be an elk, when you were thinking about generating food?
I think in general, if a creature is bigger than a 3/3, it's an elk. If there's no creatures on the board, I'm eaten. Otherwise, it's pretty simple. Just play him. If there's a creature, make an elk. If there are no creatures, make a food. Unless the creature is super tiny. Like, I'm not sure I would actually necessarily elk a Llanowar Elves or a Dork, but I would probably elk a Noble Hierarch.
Would you elk a Monastery Swiftspear?
In a prowess deck?
Yeah.
All day.
Instead of making a food?
It depends on the board state, probably. Like if I have like a Mana Dork out, I mean, I'd probably just elk. Here's what I'm thinking though. Here's the thing, Dave, is the elking being a plus sort of invalidates the creation of the 3/3. Because even if you don't have a blocker down, unless they have some like red-based burn damage or a hasty creature to come along for the ride, you still have a living Oko on the other side. And then you can just +2 it the next turn to generate a food token.
Right.
Yeah, Dave, that's a really interesting question. What's more valuable, the prowess or the life a turn, perhaps as late as a turn later, right? Because there are some conditions where you don't actually have the mana to crack that food on the spot.
Right.
I think in a vacuum, I would, assuming I'm not dead to like a burn spell or two and a swing from the Swift Spear, I'd probably make a food that I would then turn into an elk because Swift Spear is very vulnerable to blockers. And sometimes gaining life isn't just a matter of gaining life via food, it's also a matter of preventing creatures from connecting with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Stan. I mean, getting into the nuance of playing Oko versus the burn deck, I think the more that they're pointing burn spells at your creatures to get that ground damage through, the happier you are.
Yep. Distraction.
But it's not really that detailed, right? I think it's pretty obvious when you're playing the games. Like if you have an out target, elk it. If you can food, right?
It's pretty elegant, I think, when it comes down to it. You know what I mean? Like the lines of play are so simple compared to some other planeswalkers that we see in Modern all the time.
When I was playing it with Teferi 3, though, I did have a lot of complex lines that I had to think of. And the general speed of the deck being slow, I ran out of time a couple matches where I was just like, poop. Like I thought too long. I was also trying to stream, which I'm not expert at yet. So I was trying to talk to people, explain my lines of thinking.
That's how they get you, buddy.
Yeah.
It was brutal. So guys, I think we have to compare this to some other 3-mana planeswalkers, right? Because when Sam Black says something like it's the best planeswalker of all time, he's incorporating mana cost with power and fit for the format that he's in, and he's in all formats. So what?
Not Pauper.
Yet.
Not Pauper Patrol, no. But shoot. You either shoot from the hip or have a nuanced answer here. What do you think? Do you agree with that statement? Most powerful 3-mana planeswalker. Most powerful planeswalker in Modern of all time.
I think I respect that opinion, and I don't have a strong argument for another walker that is outright stronger.
What a diplomatic way to say it.
Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that I think he's as good as all the other most powerful planeswalkers out there. And depending on which deck you're in, and maybe Oko belongs in every deck, but depending on which deck you're in, you might find that he's as good as Liliana is in a Liliana deck.
Yeah, so what's our comparison, right? Teferi 3, Liliana the Veil.
Jace the Mind Sculptor, Obnixilis Reignited, the perfect planeswalker.
All the Obnixiluses.
Yeah, that's the thing about Ob. He's not the best walker. He's just the perfect walker.
I think that's true personally, but that's just me. The, Ren and 6 is another one that people have been really hot on lately, of course, and that's one you could throw in the same bucket. I mean, I think those are generally considered the best 4, right? Those are the ones you'll see the most. Liliana the Veil, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi 3, Ren and 6, and Oko.
Karn the Great Creator.
Karn and the Karns are different.
Very different.
I feel like you can't throw those in the same bucket because they're combo pieces.
Yes, they only go in like a Karn deck, a deck that can sustain Karn.
Yeah, either through a ramp or through like, the other pieces around him. Yeah.
So I don't know.
So in talking to Zach about this, he compared Oko to Teferi 3, basically saying that Oko might not actually be as strong as 3 Fairy. Zach wrote in the notes that he might only be slightly below 3 Fairy in terms of power level. And that's interesting to me because I was always thinking about Oko specifically against Liliana of the Veil, which I've often considered the strongest 3 CMC walker. And looking at Lily, she's got 3 relevant abilities that are likewise flexible in a variety of matchups. And depending on your deck's role and the game state, it feels like anything she does can help you stabilize from behind or gradually begin to pull ahead in a stalemate. And I see Oko basically having the exact same impact on a lot of games where he just goes about it in a different way, but is also quite a bit harder to kill than Lily. So perhaps he's not taking a creature off the board, but for certain permanents, turning them into a vanilla 3/3 is better or as good as just getting rid of it outright.
Totally.
Also, really importantly, that I think people kind of neglect is Liliana, her removal ability, one is not targeted. I mean, it targets the opponent, but does not target the permanent you want to remove.
Right.
So if they have even more than one permanent Although in a mid-range shell, you're hoping that they don't really have that, but that's really not the norm. If you're dropping a Liliana, they may have 2 or 3 permanents and get to select. Like they just might sacrifice their noble hierarch, and you're like, well, poop. I wanted to get rid of that Death Shadow on the other side of the game, on the side of the board. When they're playing, I don't know, black-green Death Shadow. I don't know. But and it's also a minus. It's a -2. She only starts with 3 loyalty. So when you drop her and immediately minus her to make the opponent sacrifice a creature, she's down to 1 loyalty. And then you have to start slowly ticking her back up in order to use that minus yet again. Whereas Oko, if you're trying to control the opponent's board on the other side, and when I say controlling the opponent's board, I mean controlling the effects of 2 permanent types on the other side of the board, whether that's the text on an artifact or whether that's a text or a power and toughness on the creatures, you are gaining loyalty. And we talked in evaluating Liliana of the Veil how valuable her plus is. Because even though it's a symmetrical effect, you're marching her towards a greater amount of value that you can then cash in later on her minus. But you almost never need to do that with Oko because you're just continually generating loyalty on him through both of his seemingly most powerful abilities. And then if you really need to, if the opponent does need to play something ultra powerful, you can then actually use the -5, which we've never even talked about. Because we're talking about his plus ability.
I never activated -5. I never really had to.
No, you don't, which is another wild thing about it.
I mean, isn't it just weird that the effects on the best planeswalker ever are so boring? They're so boring. One of them is Healing Salve.
Yeah.
And then the other one is Pongify.
Beast Within.
And it's just like amazing because they're pluses and because some of the modifying text of it is like a creature or artifact, and the fact that the food is an artifact, so you get all these kind of like second level effects, and also it's just cards. Like they're just good, useful cards, and they plus him the whole way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of say best planeswalker, right, to ultimately answer the question. But I think if you're talking about a mid-range strategy, I think that it's not hard to say Oko is better than Liliana of the Veil for the reasons that I mentioned earlier.
Doesn't it seem like weirdly like Liliana of the Veil's time is just like done now?
She had a really good run.
Yeah, she had a really good run right up until I finished my playset, and then boom.
The one thing I can say definitively about Oko and his power level is I think he might be the best planeswalker in Pioneer.
Huh. I don't know. I think Teferi 3 might want to have a discussion with you too, but I feel like those are definitely the 2 best.
Yeah. More on that later.
Yep. So how are you killing an Oko?
You're not. You're just not. I felt like unless I actually made a mistake that I then was able to look back on and see where I went wrong, Okos don't die. Because I never saw Dreadbore, I never saw Angrath's Rampage, Hero's Downfall, or Murderous Rival. And these are all cards that say destroy target planeswalker. So even though there were some games I lost, even though I cast an Oko, I was usually still losing with an Oko on the board. And the experience I've had playing with him basically lines up this way. He struggles against multiple threats, so against something like humans, affinity, or any deck that can make several bodies on the field that could just then ignore the walker or kill him with one swing. But pretending he doesn't exist was almost always the best plan of attack against an Oko deck.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, I'm just starting to get to the point where I wonder if the format actually needs to catch up to these powerful, impactful, and almost format warping planeswalkers as a card type. And the way we start to think about sideboard strategies and our strategies against graveyards or artifacts or what have you, maybe people need to start acknowledging that planeswalkers are a card type we need to have answers for, whether it's Fry or Dreadbore or Assassin's Trophy, what have you.
I definitely think that I had opponents become hyper-focused on Oko, and were putting way too much damage into him versus into me. Because Oko, for me, in the Snowblade deck, was really about either buying time or invalidating creatures. Because I wasn't able to set up my my Stoneforge packaged quite well. I hadn't drawn a Stoneforge. I hadn't been able to put the sword onto the battlefield. They removed the Stoneforge Mystic, and I had to cast the sword naturally. We all know that Stoneforge Mystic is not a fast strategy, really. And so Oko really enables the speed of that deck by slowing the opponent down in a lot of ways. But if you're an aggressive deck, I think you need to continue putting damage into your opponent as opposed to the Oko, because you're just playing into their hands and letting Oko generate even more value than he needs to.
Did anyone else besides me ever feel like you lost a game against a player with Oko on the board primarily because you wasted time and turns actually trying to kill Oko by swinging creatures into him? And in retrospect, you may have actually won if you just pretended he wasn't there.
I didn't. I haven't had that happen yet, but it's certainly a situation I could see happening, especially if you're on a deck that's aggressive.
Oko is one of those cards that I think really creates a lot of value out of you being able to look ahead a number of turns. And I think that's a real level up for a lot of players, and I'm still barely getting to a few turns ahead at best. And I think because you have to be able to think about your math, right? Like, okay, if I do this now, if I put the damage into Oko, what's that going to mean when they elk my creature or generate a food and then they're able to cash it in? And so I think that you can't be hyper focused on the board state, and you have to be able to think, well, what does this board state mean next turn or the turn after, and with the cards in my hand and how fast I can deploy them and what that means for the turn after that. And I think that's an interesting skill test of the Oko card on the other side of the battlefield. When you're playing Oko, it doesn't feel super skill testing. You're just sort of removing the biggest threat or generating life when you need to.
I don't know, giving your opponent some food in exchange for their Primeval Titan seems good.
I'll take it.
I definitely want to be able to get these 2 Mystic Sanctuaries out of my deck with your Primeval Titan. That sounds good.
Yes, please.
Dave, did you ever have an Oko removed?
Oh, all the time in the deck that I was playing, but I think that was because I didn't have any way to protect it other than point removal. And so if I got in a spot where I didn't have point removal, I didn't have the right point removal, for example, then they would just get taken out. But it was my choice to play it unprotected because I needed it to do something, where I wanted them to kill it, to use some resources to kill it instead of killing me. So I think it was a bit more on plan for what I was trying to do to dispose of my Okos.
Cool.
So we've talked about Oko a lot, right? I don't know if we have any more parting thoughts about gameplay with Oko, or if we're supposed to talk about the question of what happens to the best planeswalker ever. Being it's so pervasive, everybody's up in arms about its existence. Are you concerned about this card, really, or?
I don't think I'm concerned about Oko in and of itself. For me, it has more to do with the direction of research and development over at Wizards of the Coast in Seattle, Washington. And I think other people are saying this, but what it really feels to me like the problem is that we've been seeing so many very powerful planeswalkers printed in the last year or two. War of the Spark, I think, was really a turning point. But we're just not seeing answers printed at the same rate. And even when we seem to get a good answer, like a card like Fry, for instance, they then print a card that's better than Fry.
Right.
So what I'm really hopeful, I'm always, I think, the most tempered member, or one of the most tempered people on the podcast with regard to the B word.
Wow.
I think.
Brags.
I think so. I don't know.
Bragging is the B word around here.
Maybe some listeners can find some old audio of me calling for the bans of something else. But I would rather just see better answers. I would rather see more opportunities for players to make decisions with their technology rather than just making a card unplayable because it's banned out of a format.
I've heard, and I think agree with the concept that this card feels like it was changed late and not properly tested.
Or never or designed and never tested and never changed.
That seems really unlikely to me. Like, I think that kind of doesn't put a good light on play design and play testing. I just think that this is kind of like a Siege Rhino effect, where they made a very late change to a card, didn't really understand the effect it would have on it, and I'm guessing it had to do with the middle, the +1 ability on the card. Fundamentally, though, I think that has a dramatic effect on many formats. We're seeing it in Standard, we're seeing it in Pioneer, we're seeing it in Modern, we're seeing it in Vintage, we're seeing it, I'm sure it's in EDH, in Brawl.
Yeah, apparently it's just the game winner in Brawl.
So I would not be surprised if this card saw a ban, only because it invalidates so many other decks and so many other strategies and makes gameplay really redundant and routine, and the play patterns are uninteresting.
So I would like to read a different card to you and see how kind of innocuous the abilities on it seem to you. Okay, so I'm just going to read you the text box of a card. Tap. Exile target land card from a graveyard. Add 1 mana of any color. Next line. Black. Tap. Exile target instant or sorcery from a graveyard. Each opponent loses 2 life. Green. Tap. Exile target creature from a graveyard. You gain 2 life.
Seems okay. Did you just design that on the fly? That's pretty good, Dave.
I did design that on the fly.
I feel like I've seen that card before, but I can't say when or where or why.
For those of you who don't know what that card was, I just read the text from the card Deathrite Shaman.
Well, so what are you getting at, though? I'm actually not seeing the comparison.
What I'm getting at a little bit here is that this card, Deathrite Shaman, was a card that was about accrual of kind of small advantages in a way that's really kind of unclear when you first read the card when it's spoiled. I don't think that people were particularly on this. I mean, it doesn't help that Modern was still pretty new when Deathrite Shaman came out, so it took a little bit of time to kind of gain some steam. Just a little bit of time, though. The thing that I'm really trying to get to here is that I don't think it's that the card is too powerful. I think it's too innocuous in some ways, and that's probably the danger of a card like Oko, is that there's not a huge downside to playing it in a format that has so many different ways to fix your mana. The stuff that it does is good in almost every deck. And so what happens is there's a natural progression where people will just put it in every archetype, and that's kind of what we've seen starting to happen as well. And so when I see a card that's kind of followed a similar trajectory, it's not a powerful card, of course, like KCI or Faithless Loot. I mean, it's a little like Faithless Looting, I guess, but that's a whole like sub branch of decks. This just kind of goes in like every deck can play this card and can play it with no downside. And so that's what I think Deathrite Shaman was ultimately, and that's why it was a problem in Legacy and Modern both.
It's homogenizing and ultimately therefore boring.
Yeah, so I worry a little bit about it from that aspect, which is that, even the memes you see about this card where it's like everything is a 3/3 elk, like that's literally what it does to Magic. It makes every deck into a 3/3 elk. So we'll see what happens. If people come up with some good tech to play against it, if they print some better answers, I think there's a lot of time left before something like this happens, but it reminds me a little bit of Deathrite Shaman if I got to think about what it really does.
Yeah, I do agree that time will tell exactly how either oppressive or just ubiquitous this card is. If it does become a Deathrite Shaman, it's just like everyone should and could play it just because of all the incidental value it accrues across strategies. But I also, I guess on some level, wouldn't even be surprised if Oko is kind of like a Jace the Mind Sculptor or Stoneforge Mystic, where he's ahead of his time in a way. And maybe he doesn't belong in Modern right now, but maybe over time, as Wizards prints better answers, the format evolves, power creeps in gradually. If we could see Oko become, a healthy, not unassuming member of the Planeswalker suite that people have access to.
To be clear, I don't think anything's going to happen to Oko in Modern soon, though. Now, Standard, it's another thought for another podcast, but.
And the future of Pioneer is very uncertain, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, folks. Oko, the Trickster. 6 mana Planeswalker that could. Only one way to get him, and that's through an intro deck, but he's worth it.
Oh man, they really bumped the price up of that weird intro deck. I mean, the other cards are useless, but Oko himself.
Wah. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going back west to ye old Pioneer Town. A joke that only I love to keep making. Stay with us.
All right, fellas, we talked about trying to figure out how to incorporate Pioneer into this podcast, and we've done the easiest answer right now, which is shove it in the wind down. So what have you all been doing with Pioneer lately? Because I know we've been pretty hyped about it.
We've been hyped about it, and the people on our Slack have been hyped about it, and people on Twitter have been hyped about it. So there's just been a lot of conversation this week about Pioneer and Oko. So we hit all the highlights this week on our episode.
I've been so hyped that I've played 3 different decks on Pioneer in the last week, in addition to the Oko Modern deck I practiced for this episode.
Stan, I am totally there with you. Like, I do not want to focus on a single deck in Pioneer, like trying to like tweak it and like figure out little nuances. I just want to play sort of different strategies and figure out which ones seem good and seem fun for me to play. Like, I do not see the point of getting into the depths of hardened scales right now to see, do I want 3 fatal push? Do I want 2 Thoughtseize?
Yeah, I agree. And I think your use of right now is really important there, because the format is still an unknown canvas, right? And until we actually have an idea of what the meta looks like, the way we do in Modern right now, I think at that point we can really start honing in on strategies. But it's really this unique time where we get to just seemingly try whatever we want and see what sticks.
Yeah, let's see.
You will never have that again.
Let's see how long that lasts. It could be a matter of days.
Or, until a new format is introduced.
Yeah. So what decks have you been playing, Stan?
I think I listed them all last week in terms of cards that I was interested in. I've been playing a lot of blue, red, and soul. And can I share a little quick trivia fact that occurred to me this week? I was playing in soul, blue, red, and soul, which is using in soul artifact, the 1 and a blue enchantment that makes an artifact into a creature with base power 5/5, and like Hangerback Walker and Ornithopter. I'm literally holding the deck in my hands as I say this. Was the very first net deck I ever built after Mike Segrist played it at Pro Tour Magic Origins.
You never forget your first net deck.
Yep.
So here's the thing. At that point, I wasn't even playing standard or constructed competitively at all. I just saw this killer deck that I wanted to bring to my kitchen table, which is where I was playing constructed most of the time at that point in my Magic life. So it's cool to be able to play that again. And it's been doing okay for me. Been tweaking a list that Canister published on Twitter recently and having a lot of fun and having like a little bit of success. I think there's some promise there. Been revisiting Is It Phoenix? Based on Ryan Overturf's list. And Green Black Elves was the first Pioneer deck I played. The first league I did in Pioneer was with Elves. And just like...
Dude, Elves seemed good. Elves seemed really good when you played me.
Yeah. Go wide, creature aggro strategies with a little bit of reach via Shaman of the Pack is not bad.
With the lack of ability for blue-white to be successful right now, seemingly, and the fact that I haven't really seen the black-based mid-range decks running like Languish, I don't really understand why the go-wide decks are not being more successful, and maybe I'm overlooking something. Probably Oko. I don't know.
I mean, I've been playing Blue Red Phoenix too. I managed to fit 1 league in. It's a good deck. It's good to get another chance to play it. I feel like Thing in the Ice is super good in this format because there's a lot of people playing a lot of creatures. So I was often kind of like, this is my only out. Then I would cantrip my way to a Thing in the Ice and then flip it up and go to town from there.
Really takes you back, right?
Oh yeah, it really takes me back to March.
Yeah, I've been focusing on Green Black Hardened Scales. I really like the deck. It doesn't have the exact same play patterns at all of Modern Hardened Scales, but it gives you a lot of fun interactions. You get a lot of fun big artifact creatures, and you get to have a lot of different lines. And I think it's got some legs. I've also been building up. I do have Blue Red Phoenix as well. I have a blue-white sort of flyers, spirits, because I had so many of these pieces already. So I'm just hyped to be able to keep playing some more. Now that the testing for this week's done, man, this podcast.
So before we get into Pioneer Challenge discussion, as of now, we've basically been playing the format for like a week, give or take, just a little under a week, maybe 6 days if you count the free-to-play tournament practice rooms on MTGO. I have not encountered anything that I feel is truly broken in a problematic way. Like I don't think I've seen what the new KCI is. And I'm starting to wonder whether the design philosophy of this era of cards was so fair that this format is going to be almost aggressively fair.
I think it's just not big enough, to be honest with you. You know, it's like 7 years of cards versus what, 14, 15,
16?
16?
Yeah.
16? Yeah. It's just so drastically different.
I think we're all going to get pretty tired of Teferi 3 real soon.
Yeah.
Dave,
Real soon.
You really took the words out of my mouth. I feel like Teferi 3 has probably been the most oppressive card that I've had to play against. And
I have not played against it yet.
The way he warps games of Magic, I used to love doing this in Modern, but being on the opposite side of a table of a Time Raveler in Pioneer just feels like there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, I think that Wizards will need to make a decision pretty soon in terms of how fun do they want the format to be. And I think that I'm purposely leaving that up to your interpretation, right? Like, so how much play and how much standardy do they want this format to feel in terms of ability to interact, in terms of strategic board-based gameplay, which is what standard typically is. And I think that is the question I would really have to propose to WotC is how interactive and how battlefield based do you want this format to be?
Yeah, it'll be fun to watch over the next couple of months. Wizards calibrate the format. I will say that I still think Cat Combo has a good chance to be problematic, and we have a little bit of data. So Shane's going to take us through the first Pioneer Challenge was held on this Saturday or Sunday.
So we got, as is typical, the top 32 decks, and it was pretty easy to break them down into archetypes, thankfully, because we don't have a preponderance of archetypes just yet, at least in this tournament. So out of the top 32, we had 9 Saheeli-based decks. So this is kind of the control combo deck of the format. So most of them are like these 4-color Saheeli decks, which is blue, white, red, green, which stretches the mana a little bit because it wants to play powerful planeswalkers like Oko, Saheeli, the aforementioned Teferi 3, creatures like Reflector Mage, creatures like Rogue Refiner, to provide kind of the tempo interaction and card draw. Gives you some removal with like Wild Slash, maybe some Harness Lightnings. You get some Heart of Kirin's typically for attacking and blocking to buy you time. You get your mana taken care of because you're running things like Gilded Goose and your Mana Elves. You have enchantments like Oath of Nissa, which lets you use any color of mana to cast your walkers. You get your rainbow lands like Aether Hub and Mana Confluence. There's even like a minor energy package in a lot of these decks. So you get like the aforementioned Rogue Refiner, generates energy while cycling itself, lets you use your Aether Hubs, and powers up that cheap removal spell of Harness Lightning.
I lost an Awoken Horror, a flipped thing in the ice, to a Harness Lightning the other day, and that was harsh. 2 mana, kill my 7/8. Boom.
I'm going to apologize to people who aren't familiar with these cards yet because we just don't have time to get into the nuts and bolts of how they work. So if you don't know the names, look them up later. I apologize.
My favorite Saheeli deck, by the way, is the Vanifar one. Can't wait to try it. Maybe I'll try it next.
And we'll have a link to the tournament results in show notes so you can find a list of all the decks there too and look up the cards that way.
So 9 of 32, it's over a quarter. Okay. We had 6 devotion decks that either are green or green splashing blue. That's kind of the big mana of this early format. So they use the power of Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, which is a land from Theros. It also has Mana Dorks, Leyline of Abundance, which we talked about in our Leyline episode as having a future home somewhere, to generate tons of mana and power out really huge threats. So the green-blue decks seem to focus on things like Hydroid Krasis, Walking Ballista, Pelucranos, World Eater, Planeswalkers like Nissa, who shakes the world, Kiora, Master of the Depths, Oko, of course. But the green decks have similar enablers, but have slightly different payoffs. They will have things like Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, which is a modern staple, of course. Nylea, God of the Hunt, to power up the other creatures on the board. Very similar decks, different kind of payoffs, I think.
Yeah, I will say quickly that there is a black devotion deck that's basically a mono black vampires deck that's in the top 38, but it's running Nykthoses. And then there's also a mono blue aggro devotion deck. So there's a bunch of people playing with devotion cards.
Yeah, but that mono blue deck did not have Nykthos.
It does not have Nykthos, but it does have the classic mono blue cards from Thassa and Master of Waves from Theros Standard. So there's definitely a bunch of people playing around with the heroic or the devotion mechanic as it is.
For sure.
But
okay, so after that, we saw 5 mid-range style decks, which are the mid-range decks of the format. So 4 of those were Sultai. One was a green-black Delirium style deck, if you remember that mechanic. From what, Shadows, or was that from Eldritch Moon?
It was in Shadows.
So Sultai midrange typically focuses around like this green-black core for the interaction, like Thoughtseize, Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Fatal Push. You get your value creatures like Corsair Crufix, Gilded Goose, Tireless Tracker, Planeswalkers like Liliana the Last Hope, Vraska, Golgari Queen.
Yep.
But when you move into blue, you get the ability to run these huge value cards, like we talked about Oko the whole episode, but you get Jace Finn's Prodigy, you get Drown in the Lock, which is showing itself to be early, 2 or 3 of in a lot of these decks. And you get Dig Through Time, which lets you peel through your deck and select cards from like the top 6? Is that correct?
Dig Through Time? 7.
Yeah, well, there you go. 7, even better than I thought. But then you also get Sideboard Counter Magic, which is a classic reason to be playing into blue. So you get like your Disdainful Strokes, Mystical Disputes, things like that.
I mean, these are your Oko decks. Straight up.
Yeah,
other than the Saheeli ones, these are your Oko mid-rangey. This is really the Jund of the format.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's your mid-range deck. I was a little bit surprised to see no Obzon. There's Siege Rhino is not an early player in this tournament. We'll see if that keeps to be the reality. But I was surprised to see not a single Obzon deck here.
No Path to Exile means no white, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, but it was such a powerful standard player during the Cons era. I think people were expecting just to see Siege Rhino come back again.
For sure.
So we saw 3 blue-red Phoenix decks, like Dave was saying he was playing, and I just put together as well. So I call these a lot of blue and red spells decks. They operate really similarly to Phoenix decks and Moderns, right? You want to get those Arclights in your graveyard, and you cast spells that enable that, and then you're also removing counters from your things in the ice, and then you're attacking, right? So you get your enablers, you get like your Merchant of the Veil via the spell half of Haggle on the adventure card there. You get Charter Course, you get Strategic Planning, you get Lightning Axe, you get Is It Charm, getting your birds in the yard there. You have your cheap burn with Wild Slash and Fiery Temper, lets you go to the face or remove creatures in your way, although that's not really a big need in these Arclight decks, while also getting your creatures online at the same time. So you do have that same engine.
Man, after playing Is It Phoenix in both Pioneer and Modern and testing a lot of these cards, even back in the days of Standard when this was a Standard deck, Is It Charm and Fiery Temper are so good in Pioneer compared to Modern. It's insane, the delta of their power.
Is It Charm is the best card to draw in this deck.
Totally,
I feel like in Pioneer, and it was like something you can't even consider running in Modern. It's wild.
I have to say, looking at Is It Charm, this is what makes me excited about Pioneer, is that card alone. Like, I'm not even like a real Is It mage, right? But I'm looking at Is It Charm, and I'm like, this card sucks in Modern. It's essentially unplayable. But it looks like it has the ability to be such a cool utility card that's enabling certain strategies, providing counter magic. It just looks dope, and I'm excited to play it. And the fact that I can play it is that's just one instance of what makes me excited about Pioneer. Yeah.
Let me tell you the card that I'm excited to play in this deck, and that's Treasure Cruise.
Never heard of it.
All aboard.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoy the cruise while you can, because if this card gets banned, it's going to be because of this deck. But because it is very good to cast 3 Treasure Cruises in one game. Feels amazing.
Yeah, I would do that. Sounds okay. Looking forward to that too. I actually brought Blue-Red Phoenix Pioneer with me for this trip, like just hoping I can get to a store on my next stop.
Idaho?
One of these nights. I'm going to be in Portland the next 3 nights. So
Portland, Maine?
home of the Portland Pod, our editor. Shout outs to Tanner. We had 2 burn decks, which are the burn decks of the format. Just pretty similar to modern burn. They have a suite of aggressive creatures, things like Monastery Swiftspear, Soulscar Mage, Eidolon of the Great Revel, backed up by burn spells. They get the advantage of running Smuggler's Copter here, or perhaps the ability to run Smuggler's Copters, because you can in the speed of this format. Gives you evasive attacking, also sculpting your hand a little bit. One of these decks was a little bit more wizard-based. It capitalized on things like Wizard Lightning, had a few more creatures, while the other was kind of more like a modern burn deck, a modern Boros burn deck. It had more spell-based aggression.
Cool.
So we'll talk quickly about how this top 8 shook out, because why not? First place, Sultai Midrange. Second place, Blue Red Phoenix. Third place, Sultai Midrange.
That was Aspiring Spike, by the way, in third place.
And that guy, he is everywhere. He is grinding and winning.
Yep.
So good on you.
He's got to work hard to get results.
Yep, and he does. He's always streaming. He's one of my go-tos when I'm working from home. So thanks, Aspiring Spike. Fourth place, Mono Blue Aggro deck. Dave talked about this deck briefly. This basically runs 28 reasonably costed blue creatures. Things like Brazen Brower, Siren Storm Tamer, Tempest Djinn. You get like your Merfolk that are legal here. Thassa, God of the Sea, to capitalize on that blue devotion. Quench broadly was considered unplayable by a lot of people, and this shows up as a 4 of, which is kind of the mana leak of modern here, the mana leak that's going to be seen in Pioneer, perhaps. It's a 1 in a blue instant.
I don't know if it's going to be seen in Pioneer for much longer.
I mean, this deck ran it. So basically the opponent has to pay 2 mana or have their spell countered. So mana leak's a 3, this is a 2. That's a pretty big difference, as we've mentioned in various ways of analyzing cards.
This deck has a lot of wizards in it. I'm like, why are we not running Wizards Rebuttal, Rebuke, or whatever?
That's a really good point.
There's 16 wizards in this deck?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Dave. I think that's probably just strictly better, but we're also not winning with this deck, so.
And we never will.
Sadly, there was no dive down. So if it's not on this deck, I don't think the card, the dive down, is going to see some play.
Easy.
Okay.
Be patient.
Patience. We can make it happen.
I mean, we don't know how they're using Quench either. Maybe dive down could just replace Quench.
Okay.
True.
So, and then 5th and 6th, 4-color Saheeli, 7th and 8th, Blue Red Phoenix. So not a super dynamic top 8 there.
Except all the Blue-Red Phoenix decks made the top 8.
They sure did.
Yep.
All 3 are in the top 8 there, and along with 2 of the 4 Sultai midrange decks. So things I saw of note, we saw 11 Oko decks, 10 Once Upon a Time decks, 9 Teferi 3 decks, 7 Gilded Goose decks. There is not a single Marvel, not a single Aetherworks Marvel in the whole top 32.
Shocking.
I just think that there's just lots of ways that just hate it outright in main decks and also sideboards. But we'll see if it makes a little comeback. Maybe just people don't have it built quite right yet. There was no Deathrite Shaman in any of the any of the black-green base decks, excuse me. There was no Hardened Scales, to my chagrin, and only 1 Collected Company deck. So, this is one tournament, this is one weekend, but some of the pillars of the format that people predicted are not pillars just yet in things like Hardened Scales, Collected Company, and Marvel. And I think we're seeing the initial pillars perhaps be formed. I personally know this is going to sound like an insane take, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is close to kind of the actual tier list until bans take place. Just in the order of that we saw here, right? Like our S tier is Saheeli, our A tier is Devotion, then we see Midrange and Phoenix behind that, red aggro type decks behind that, and then kind of everything else, and then F is Marvel. That's where I'm at right now. I wouldn't be surprised if this is what we see until like a ban.
All
Call
right.
shots for initial bans too soon? Or
I don't wanna. That's like negative. I want to be positive about this format for a bit.
Same.
Teferi 3.
Just sneaking in there, Stan.
Just the way he impacts the Saheeli combo.
It's an unfun card.
Yeah,
it's an unfun card.
It's just, Splinter Twin decks used to force opponents to hold up interaction and not play Magic. Teferi 3 makes it such that you just can't play Magic because you only cast spells at sorcery speed.
I will say that one of my match losses, I narrowly missed a 4-1, was against Saheeli because I misplayed flipping my thing in the ice pre-combat. I was like holding it up to try to do something tricky, and then I realized I couldn't play my opt during the begin combat step, and I was just done after that. Couldn't do enough damage.
Well, there you have it, folks. Pioneer is solved. If you look at Twitter, every deck is broken. But if you ask me, I think most decks are just pretty good. I'm really excited to see where the format goes. I get to start playing it at the LGS in November. We finally had a shop in Chicago announce their weekly Pioneer schedule as kind of a pilot program. So I will definitely want to talk about it some more on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, I think my LGS had a Saturday tournament, like the very first Saturday. I wasn't able to go because I just had to clean gutters like an adult. Ugh. But I think they had like 14 people show up, which is pretty fast to put that together and clear your schedule to show up on Saturday. So I am hyped for the Wednesday night Pioneer that's starting up there.
Well, that wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern, you can tweet us at thedivedown, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon. Joining at any tier gets you access to our super secret Slack channel. You can do that at patreon.com/thedivedown. Also, shout out to manatraders.com for sponsoring The Dive Down. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown, all one word, for 10% off your first 3 months of renting paper or Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and elk that food!